In our first two episodes, we explored possession cases that shook entire communities. Eleanor Zugan in 1920s Romania, whose ordeal helped inspire The Exorcist, and Scotland's own history of people believed to have been taken over by the devil himself. But sometimes these stories don't begin in churches or courtrooms. Sometimes they start in the middle of an ordinary working day. And this is one of those stories. It began in the 1970s at a gas storage site in Kilmarnock, where a man named John found himself at the centre of a strange and escalating haunting. At first it was just stones thrown from nowhere, objects going missing, small things that could be explained away. But over time, the force behind them, something John came to call Jonathon, grew bolder, stranger, and far more dangerous. What makes this case unusual is that it didn't stop when John left the site. The activity followed him home, into pubs, into friends' houses, even into his sleep. And as the years passed, it became harder to say whether John was dealing with a poltergeist or something that had taken a far greater hold over him. Ayrshire's coastline and farmland have long been fertile ground for tales of mischief from beyond the Vale. In old accounts, it was the fair folk or brownies who would attach themselves to a household, helpful one day, vindictive the next. In other stories, it was a restless ghost or bogle that refused to keep to one place, slipping from farm to farm as if carried in someone's shadow. These spirits were rarely silent. They moved things, hid tools, played pranks, and seemed to delight in reminding their victims that they were never truly alone or in control. Local superstition warned that once such a presence took an interest in you, it could follow you anywhere, and no wall or door could keep it out. One of the best documented examples of this comes from Dalry in 1576, when a local woman named Bessie Dunlop claimed to be guided by the ghost of a man called Thomas Reid. She said he had once been a soldier, but was now trapped between worlds. He sought her company and counselled her on matters both mundane and supernatural. To the authorities this was clear: witchcraft. Bessie was condemned and burned at the stake in Edinburgh, her fate sealed less by any act of harm than by the company she claimed to keep. Yet her account remains a rare first-hand description of a spirit that seemed bound to a living person, shadowing and guiding her through daily life, a pattern echoed centuries later in Ayrshire's folklore of familiar spirits. For earlier generations, such tales weren't entertainment, they were treated as warnings. A spirit's attachment could be as real a threat as illness or bad weather, and was spoken of with the same seriousness. Even within living memory, there were those who swore that certain people or places carried something with them. This was a widely held belief as recently as the 1950s. A miner at the Auchingeich pit said a shadow he saw on the ground had followed him home. He reported that odd things started happening to him. Strange mishaps and tools vanishing, all of which stopped the moment he left the job. By the 1970s, most people in Ayrshire might have dismissed these stories as the product of bygone times. But on the edge of Kilmarnock, at a newly built gas storage station, a group of workers were about to discover that the old tales had not lost their bite. One of them, a man named John, would find himself at the centre of a haunting that began with flying stones and ended with something far stranger. John was, in many ways, like many young men on the west coast of Scotland in the 1970s. Work was scarce, so when the chance came to sign on with a contractor for the gas board, he jumped at it. The job brought him to a storage station on the edge of Kilmarnock and into the middle of something he could never have expected. The first sign that something wasn't right came suddenly and without warning. John was busy working when the usual clatter of tools and the hum of conversation was broken by a sharp crack against the side of the tank. A stone had seemingly hit the gas tank he was working beside. He turned to see the same puzzled look on his colleagues' faces, just as a second stone struck, and then a third. They hit with force, some ricocheting off the tank, others clipping the walls nearby. The shots were too deliberate to be chance, yet the site was small, with nowhere for the culprit to hide. For a moment, there was silence. Everyone stood still, scanning the open ground. Then, with nothing to explain it, they muttered to each other and went back to work. The next incident was harder to laugh off, and it started with the gate's keys going missing. When they eventually turned up, they weren't lying on the ground or hanging where they should have been. They were jammed deep into the narrow cracks in the perimeter wall, pushed in so far it took effort to get them out. At first the men laughed it off as some daft prank, but after it happened a few more times, it became harder to joke about. The site was too small, the crew too few. Everyone noticed where everyone else was. Whoever was doing it would have been seen. Tension was starting to build when the disturbances escalated. Tools and now personal items began vanishing, only to reappear in places no one would think to look. One day, when a board manager arrived on site, he was met with a sudden hail of stones from an unseen hand. They struck the roof and bonnet of his car in quick succession as he climbed out. It was a direct and deliberate act, and, as John would learn later, not without reason. When work at Kilmarnock finished, John and his crew moved to another gas storage project in Lanark. They assumed the strange incidents would be left behind, but they weren't. Before long, the same stone throwing began, this time from a small mound beside the tank, the rock striking with the same uncanny accuracy as before. Then the activity took a more personal turn. There was a metal walkway circling the tank. This was often used by the men when shouting and trying to communicate with each other. For part of the circuit around the tank, the wall on one side dipped out of sight behind the curve of the structure. It was a blind spot, but only for a few seconds. Long enough that anything could happen there without being seen. It was on that section that the first mark appeared, a single rough R, scratched into the plaster. The edges jagged as if cut with a sharp stone. No one admitted to doing it. A few days later, the message grew. The full word Rocky appeared, followed by the words from below. Rocky was John's nickname. Whoever or whatever was behind it had singled him out. So John decided to take the initiative. He started leaving questions of his own, etched into the plaster as he passed. Then he'd carry on round the short loop of the walkway and check again when he reached a blind spot. Every time there was an answer waiting. The replies came too quick for anyone to have worked on them unseen. It was almost as if the writer had been waiting for the question to be asked. At first, the messages stayed simple. Single words, fragments, almost playful. But as the days went on, they became more complex. The handwriting changed too. The rough scratches deepened, growing sharper, more deliberate, as though the hand behind them had learned to shape its thoughts. One morning John found fresh writing near the lower section of the tank, The same jagged letters as before, but this time spelling out something different. 2 initials, J.V. At first he thought it may be another man's name, a passing joke, or even the work of a rival crew. But the pattern continued. Wherever he went, the new marks appeared. JV in the dust, on the plaster, sometimes even traced faintly into the condensation on the tank's metal skin. When he asked, half joking, who JV was, the answer came back almost instantly, carved into the same spot he'd written his question. Jonathon. From then on, the thing seemed to know he was near. Wherever John and his crew were sent, the presence that called itself Jonathon seemed to follow. At their next site in Motherwell, the disturbances began almost as soon as they started. One afternoon, without warning, the access gate in the hoarding slammed open with a force that made everyone stop and look. Before anyone could react, a pickaxe came hurtling through the gap. It spun once in the air, the metal head catching the light, before slicing past the men inside. The sound of it cutting through the air was sharp enough to make a couple of them flinch. It buried itself in the ground with a dull, heavy thud, quivering where it landed. It had missed them by inches, close enough that everyone present knew it could have been much worse. The angle and speed of its flight suggested control rather than clumsiness. It felt calculated, almost like a demonstration, a reminder that whoever or whatever was behind the disturbances could get that close at will. And soon other strange objects began appearing. One day, a folded newspaper seemed to drift through the air from nowhere before snagging against the wire fence. Harry, one of the crew, went over to fetch it. When he unfolded the pages, there it was, the now familiar initials JV scrawled across it. Jonathon had made his presence known again. The objects began getting bigger. Climbing the gantry one morning, the men found their way blocked by a large pile of timber that wasn't there before. It looked as though it had been deliberately stacked to stop them passing. Yet when they came back later, the obstruction was gone, and the gantry completely clear. Sometimes Jonathon left other calling cards, notes, crudely marked with a skull and crossbones. And when John asked why, the only answer scratched into the wall that it was his mark. No further explanation. One day John asked a direct question. Why had Jonathon followed them? The reply came back. The presence has to be. Jonathon claimed the site had once been his home before the gas board built over it. He asked for help repeatedly, but never explained what kind of help he needed or how they were meant to give it. Eventually, a few of the men decided they'd had enough of the guessing games. If Jonathon wanted to talk, then they had to meet him halfway. Someone produced an old Ouija board, and they set it down inside the bothy, the small wooden hut where they took breaks. John wanted no part in it. He'd seen enough already and had no interest in inviting anything closer. He stepped outside, leaning against the wall, and listened to the muffled voices within as they began. It didn't take long. A sharp, cracking bang rang out from somewhere above him, making him instinctively duck. A split second later, a glass milk bottle came hurtling down, exploding on the ground by his feet, shards skittering out across the dirt. Inside the bothy, things were spiralling. Without warning, a heavy chest of drawers in the corner began to move. At first it rocked slightly, then harder, until it was slamming repeatedly against the wall, with a force that shook the whole hut. The men backed away from it, chairs scraping against the floor. The session abandoned on the spot, and nobody touched the board again. The attachment to John was becoming more obvious. Every evening, driving back to Glasgow, the men in the van reported a strange sensation, as if something heavy was pulling the vehicle backwards. On one journey back to Glasgow, the van was quiet. The men slouched in their seats after a long shift. Without warning, a hard hat from the pile of gear in the back lifted and shot forward across the interior. It moved fast enough that no one had time to react before it struck the driver square across the cheek. The crack of the impact was followed by a sharp intake of breath, and the driver swore and grabbed his face, somehow keeping the van steady on the road. The hat dropped to the floor between his feet. Nobody had touched it, and the way it had come forward, a clean, straight line from the rear of the van, there was no doubt it had been propelled with intent. Unsurprisingly, the atmosphere in the van darkened. Whatever was riding in the back with them wasn't content to stay quiet. Whether intentional or not, it was clear Jonathon's presence was strongest when John was there. Was he drawing energy from them? Was that why he clung so tightly? Back at John's home, the activity didn't stop. The curtains shifted without a breeze. His table suddenly flipped over. Bill, one of his friends, had a cigarette flicked from his hand, scattering sparks across the room. And when he tried to relight it, the flame flared in a way that felt deliberate, as if it was meant to catch him out, maybe even hurt him. Jonathon's actions could be shocking, even impressive, but they never seemed random. Once John placed a scrambled Rubik's Cube into a cupboard, and minutes later, when he took it out, it was solved. There were multiple witnesses to this bizarre event. Even when he was out with friends, John couldn't escape the attention of his invisible shadow. Jonathon followed him everywhere, and increasingly it drew others in. One night in their local pub in Partick, something seemed to change. It wasn't anything you could point to at first, just a feeling in the air, the kind that makes people glance over their shoulders without knowing why. And then it began. Coins shot across the room, spinning in midair before striking tables and zipping across the floor. People froze, staring at the scattered change. While they were trying to gather their thoughts, a folded piece of paper came out of nowhere, sailing past heads and landing at the feet of the waitress. She bent to pick it up, opened it, and read the words, "Rocky, help JV." No one knew what it meant. No one recognised the handwriting. The pub's phone rang twice that evening. The first time when it was answered, there was nothing but a strange low hiss, a faint sound in the background, almost like two people speaking far away, their voices blurred into one indistinct murmur. A few minutes later the phone rang again. This time John was called over. Inside, a man stood holding the receiver, frowning. He swore it had been connected a moment earlier, but when John lifted it, the line was dead. The man just stared at him, confused. And the oddness didn't stop there. A friend's soft drink was sitting untouched on the table when a glass ashtray, no one saw from where, fell directly into it. The crash of the breaking glass shocked the entire table, drinks spilling across the surface in a spreading, sticky pool. No one could explain how an ashtray could have dropped from above in a single-story bar. On another visit, John went to the cigarette machine. He bought a packet, sat down, unwrapped it, and found it empty. Swearing under his breath, he crushed it and tossed it away. 10 minutes later, someone opened the machine again. Sitting there, as if it had been waiting the whole time, was the exact same packet, but now with cigarettes inside. The room had gone quieter by then, and people kept staring towards John, some with curiosity, others with something closer to wariness. John had seen enough to know who he thought was behind it: Jonathon. And it wasn't just the pub. One evening, John walked into his living room and stopped dead. On the floor lay the remains of a whiskey bottle, or what should have been its remains. The glass wasn't smashed into pieces. It had been ground into a fine, glittering dust, like sand. The label and the metal cap were untouched, sitting neatly where the neck should have been. No one could explain how such a thing could happen without heat, pressure, or machinery. Then the disturbances took on a mocking edge. Strips of spaghetti fell onto the table in the shape of a skull and crossbones, Jonathon's calling card. A spill of peas arranged themselves into the shape of a question mark on the floor. Notes appeared from nowhere with a single word, "Why," scrawled on them. One morning, John woke to find a huge, intricate model of a pirate ship in his living room. Something he guessed would have taken thousands of matches and hours of work. He had no idea where it come from. He knew no one who had such a model. So he destroyed it, along with the other objects that appeared out of nowhere. He didn't want anything linked with Jonathon in his home. And then came the day of the noises. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of dull grey day when the streets outside felt heavy and slow. John was in the living room, half watching the television, when the first blow landed. A single deafening thud overhead. Sharp, solid, and close enough to make the ceiling tremble. He froze, listening. The second came seconds later, louder than the first, like a sledgehammer striking solid timber. The sound had a weight to it, a vibration that seemed to travel down through the walls and into the floorboards beneath his feet. Bang, bang, bang. Each one spaced just enough to keep him on edge, each one hitting with the same relentless, incredible force. There was no rhythm, no fumbling about. Every strike sounded deliberate, as if aimed. John stood, craning his neck towards the ceiling. The rafters were above the attic space, but there was no way anyone could be up there without him knowing. He stepped into the hallway, the sound following him, moving slightly overhead as he did, as if something or someone was tracking him from above. He thought about going up, but a feeling in his gut stopped him. The noise wasn't the kind you investigated, it was the kind you waited out. So he stayed where he was, listening to those heavy, punishing blows land again and again. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it made the room feel empty in a way that he hadn't noticed before. He almost wished for the banging to return. But from that moment on, Jonathon was gone. There were no more notes, no more objects, no more coins flying through the air. John never heard from him again. Later he wondered if those blows had been something more than noise, a closing, a sealing off, like the last nails being driven into a door between worlds. Whatever it was, it felt final. But peace didn't last long. By October, John seemingly found himself caught in the grip of another poltergeist. This one more aggressive, more violent. It attacked him even as he slept, throwing objects and thrashing them around the room. The first night it happened, he woke to a crash somewhere in the room. Still half asleep, he thought something had simply fallen from the bedside table. Then another object hit the wall, hard. A second later, something else followed. He sat up, the dark around him shifting with movement. Books slid from a shelf and struck the floor. A shoe flew past the foot of the bed, landing with a dull thud. Then came the real shock. The sensation of the whole room being in motion. Small objects rattled and skittered across the floor, as though the air itself had been shaken. And it didn't stop there. The blanket pulled tight across his legs without warning, as if gripped by unseen hands, and a framed picture pitched forward from the dresser, shattering on the floor. He cried out, demanding it stop, but there was no reply, only the sound of things being hurled, one after the other, until the room looked as if it had been ransacked. Then, as abruptly as it started, it ended. John sat in the silence, his heart hammering, glass crouching under his bare feet as he got out of bed. Whatever this was, it was different from Jonathon. It wasn't curious or playful, or trying to send a message. It felt focused, and the focus was on him. Not just to frighten him, but to reach him, almost as if it wanted to be inside. Desperate, John turned to a local psychic, hoping they could rid him of whatever had attached itself. They met in his home, the curtains drawn, the air still. The psychic began by circling him slowly, murmuring under their breath, hands raised, as if feeling for something invisible. Then they stopped directly in front of him, eyes fixed, and told him to sit. Almost at once, John felt it, a pressure deep inside, as if something was hooked to his chest and pulling outward. It wasn't the air moving or an object being thrown. It was happening inside him, pulling at something he couldn't see. His whole body began to shake. It wasn't just trembling, it was violent, uncontrollable, like he was being rattled from inside. His vision blurred and his teeth chattered, the sound loud in the quiet room. The psychic urged him to let it go, their voice rising over the sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor as his body jolted. But whatever was inside him wasn't loosening its grip. The pulling sensation grew sharper, twisting through him, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. Then it stopped. The air felt heavier, but the presence was still there, lodged inside him, untouched by the attempt to force it out, as if it had retreated deeper, waiting. For several days after, he felt drained, unsteady and oddly hollow, as though something had been moving inside him and then gone still. The pressure never fully left, and at times it seemed to shift, an odd tightening in his chest, or a heaviness at the back of his head. The sense of being watched from within came and went, but never truly disappeared entirely. In need of answers, he visited another medium. After a ritual, John felt as though something had been pulled from him, but only part of it. He was convinced the main presence was still there. The medium agreed, suggesting they try to communicate instead of banish. At first, John was willing, and using a pendulum he asked questions, and watched it swing towards letters, spelling out words. Soon the spirit began working through him directly. With a pen in hand, John found his own writing replaced by something else, a style that wasn't his, sentences he didn't plan. There were times he would look at the page and feel as though he'd been somewhere else entirely, while the words appeared. A lapse, a blank stretch in which something else had been present. What began as curiosity turned into something more frightening. He wasn't sure where his thoughts ended and the spirit's began. It's as if they had become connected, and he didn't know how to undo it. By trying to communicate with the entity, John may have made things worse. The more he engaged, the stronger it seemed to become, until it began to take over. It would wake him abruptly in the night, jerking him out of sleep and with an overwhelming urge to write. His hand would move almost before his mind had caught up. scrawling words and sentences he didn't feel were his own. The entity made itself known in other ways too, flicking lights on and off without warning, banging loudly on the roof, slamming doors hard enough to rattle the frames. Objects he'd left neatly on the bedside table would be hurled to the floor. Sometimes furniture shifted by itself. Some nights he'd feel sharp tugs on his legs, as though something invisible was standing over him, pulling. The most frightening sensation of all was the feeling that an invisible presence was trying to get inside him still. It became clear that whatever this was, it wasn't only trying to talk. The messages it forced through him were an unnerving mix of threats, nonsense, and strange, specific claims. One written in December 1992 stood out for its disturbing tone. I am from Dalry, a music man, and I will get out of your body now. You are now free from me, and I will go out of your house because, as you well know, I'm going to kill you. I will not be here tomorrow morning and you will be sick. I have found another, and I won't be getting any more messages as you have found a weakness. I won't be able to possess you anymore after tonight. Other writings were less direct but equally strange. John filled page after page with lists of names. Politicians, celebrities, people long dead. Some of them, he said, you must look up before I go. You must check the world. Many of the names were linked to intelligence agencies like the CIA. One claimed to come from a world beyond our galaxy, and spoke of top secret information about a UFO crash in the Arizona desert in 1961. Several messages claimed that spirits and UFOs were connected, suggesting a link between poltergeist activity and alien phenomena. As the weeks went on, John also began noticing other disturbances, unexplained smells that came and went in seconds, electronic devices falling without reason, and equipment switching on or off by itself. It felt as though he'd somehow plugged into a power source from another world, one that could just as easily send gibberish as it could deliver chilling, direct threats. So why had John become the focus of such prolonged possession? One psychic had told him to keep the radio playing softly at all times, claiming this would act as a psychic barrier. John, an otherwise ordinary man, has done this ever since. Even after the main disturbances ended, strange events still found him. One evening, while returning home, he saw an odd light inside his living room. When he rushed to the door to investigate, nothing was there. But soon more lights appeared, moving across the walls. Other people witnessed things too. An investigator recalled a report of a human-shaped figure whose features were twisted and distorted, like an animal wearing a human face. John himself described seeing not just one version of this presence, but several, creatures that looked uncannily like himself, as though each was an altered copy. One of these figures attacked him, emitting flashes of red and blue light. Thankfully, he fought it off, but the message it left him with was stark. They are out there, and they are capable of taking over. John kept a list of the effects these spirits had on him. They moved objects, slammed doors, switched lights on and off, and, most disturbingly, tried to force their way inside him. He said one even tried to take over his sister. The entities gave themselves bizarre, almost cartoonish names. Sabril, Voltarin, Ruspin. They sounded absurd, even harmless at first, as though the very ridiculousness of their names was meant to disguise something darker. But John quickly learned that the ones who joked, who played at being harmless, were never the ones to fear. The real danger came from the darker ones. These were stronger, more focused, and seemed to know exactly how to get inside his head. They didn't always speak aloud. Sometimes it was a voice in the room, close enough that he could feel the breath on his ear. Other times it was inside his own thoughts, sliding in without a warning, a phrase or an image that felt as though it didn't belong to him. On the worst nights, the words arrived in his mouth before he knew he was speaking them, his own voice delivering messages he hadn't formed. One, he claimed, lived under his table and entered his dreams. It didn't just appear in them, it took control of the scene, bending the dream to its own shape, speaking directly to him. These visitations left him waking in the small hours with a distinct sense he'd been somewhere else, and that something had followed him back. They lied to him constantly. They contradicted themselves. Sometimes these creatures seemed to fight among themselves, each taking turns to speak through him or to him. If there was a truth behind it all, John never found it. Perhaps there was none. Perhaps the chaos was the point, to keep him unbalanced, doubting his own senses. And if you believe in that sort of thing, the years of relentless poltergeist activity, the thrown objects, the sudden shocks, the strange messages, could have done more than just wear him down. They might have opened the door. What began as a curious presence outside him, knocking and pushing at the edges of his life, may have crossed the threshold entirely. Possession, if that's what it was, didn't arrive all at once. It slipped in slowly, a little more each time he was too tired, too distracted, or too drained to resist. John was never sure what was real, what was deception, and what might have been shaped by his own mind under pressure. But he is convinced of one thing. The creatures he saw, the ones that could look almost human, exist. Whether they were ghosts or something else entirely, he still doesn't know. But his warning is simple. If they can appear as ordinary men, and they can take control, we may not notice them until it's too late. The disturbances didn't stop at the workplace. They followed John home, lodged in his words and his sleep, as if whatever this was had chosen the man rather than the site. Cases like this are rare, but they aren't unique. Sometimes a haunting doesn't belong to a building, it belongs to a person. And that's what makes John's story so unsettling. From stones on tanks to coins in pubs, the activity tracked him across jobs, houses and friendships. When the initial episodes faded, something harsher moved in, more focused, more invasive. John's days became a series of small defences, a radio left on all night, a constant watch for early signs, an exhaustion the others couldn't see. The pattern here suggests a hard truth. Once the attention of whatever this is locks on, it can travel, adapt, and in some cases take hold. John never settled on an explanation. Maybe Jonathon was a ghost, maybe a trickster, maybe something darker. By the end though, John believed it had been inside him, not just around him. That belief that he had been possessed is what makes this case one of the most unusual in modern Scotland. If there's a thread through this 3-part series, it isn't proof, it's consequence. Whether in Romania, in church records from centuries past, or in a scaffolded yard on the outskirts of Kilmarnock, the same fear surfaces. That something we can't see can find you, and that naming it matters, for the sufferer, for the family, for the community. you may have noticed I've used words like demon carefully, because language shapes how we respond. These accounts aren't included to sell terror, they're included because they were life-changing for the people involved. They left scars, habits and questions. We all live with our own quieter demons, memories, doubts, impulses that follow us without spectacle. They may not crawl over rafters or throw ashtrays, but they attach themselves all the same. Perhaps that's the real reason these stories stay with us. They reflect the human urge to name and to be believed when we say something is wrong. So this is where our 3-part journey ends, not with answers, but with witnesses, not with certainty, but with the recognition that some things are better held in careful memory than in a rush of judgment. If anything has changed for me after telling these stories, it's this. I no longer listen for the noise alone. I listen for the person behind it.